Well, let's start with some block and tackle stuff. When you first started to play, did you find the drums easy or was it tough from the beginning?
I have never found drums to be particularly easy. I think that I've always been, um, I was always challenged by any type of music lessons or formal music schooling. I tried to do all of those things. It never clicked. And I think that I always loved it for whatever reason. And I had a weird journey where I found it. I started playing as a young kid, like when I was around 12. And then, but I was still playing sports a lot back then. So like sports were more of my focus. And I had been like jamming with people starting really young. And that's what I always enjoyed. Like I liked playing with other people. I hated rudiments. I hated lessons. I actually had a really negative experience with my first drum teacher, which was very creepy, which I think soured me on music schooling. But I didn't really start fully committing to drums until after I broke my back and had a back surgery and then could no longer do skateboarding, snowboarding, soccer, basketball, like all these things. And then that was the moment. It was basically when I was around like 16 that I really started to be like, okay, I think I'm a drummer now. I think I play drums. I was more motivated to do that stuff. But to this day, I try harder than my skill level. And I'm not a drummer that necessarily makes things look easy, I don't think. But, in my own right, I think I've developed a style. But by no means is it easy for me ever. And I constantly add things to my plate to make it more challenging, I think.
How does that manifest in the day-to-day? Like when you get in the practice room, what are some things you're working on recently?
I think that like my skill sets for the different projects are very different. So, for Bell Witch, my general focus, and I think that this is because drums come naturally to me in some regard, but when I'm in Bell Witch mode, it's primarily focusing on all the electronics I'm doing. Are you familiar with the setup that I have in that band?
Only with the music. I haven't deep dived on the setup.
Gotcha. Okay, so yeah, for what it's worth, in Bell Witch, I basically have the floor tom and snare are free floated, which allows me to put two Roland PK5 MIDI controllers directly underneath the snare and the floor tom, positioned like next to the kick pedal, which allows me to play. My setup currently is I control 4 different synthesizers and 2 organ modules while playing drums and doing vocals. So most of my focus in Bell Witch is first finding the proper drum part, but then really integrating vocals and all of the electronics into playing the drums at the same time, which has almost nothing to do with the drums. It's just like a complete coordination test. And then like the band I'm recording with it tomorrow, that's based out of Texas. I'm the only person that lives in the Northwest. It's called Corpus Awful. That's like the gnarliest drumming I've ever played. So it's completely different. It's just like blast beats, double kick. It's like an endurance test. I should be practicing for that more. Autophagy, which is the death metal band I'm in from Portland, that one I'm the lead vocalist and do the drums, which is its own version of an endurance test, but also, coordination. And for me, the focus is mostly on vocals and figuring out how to do the polyrhythms between vocals and drumming. So the day-to-day of me playing drums is I don't play drums enough. I'm super busy. I have a day job. I'm traveling all the time. I really still only practice when I'm in the room. Most of my practicing comes down to like active listening and lap drumming, which is what I've always done.
It's interesting. I remember talking to Matt Halpern a couple years ago and asking him like how he learns songs for Periphery. And he said something similar. He said he does a lot of his practicing in the cold plunge, like literally just slapping the water. And my question for you is the same as my question for him, which is like, you must have done a decent amount of prep work on the drums so that you would be able to have the muscle memory to just sort of lap drum something or like listen to it and have it be ingrained. What was like the biggest period of growth for you on the instrument, and what spurred it, I guess?
Well, so yeah, in high school, I was in like a band that played some shows, but it was kind of like we were taking it seriously, but it wasn't that serious. Really, what happened was I moved out of like where I kind of grew up, went to college. I packed my drums up in the back of my truck, and they literally just sat there for almost a year. And at that time, my big focus was drugs. And I remember just like looking for anywhere to keep my drums, essentially. And the first people that asked me to play drums were these like kind of like frat guys. They were super nice, but like we didn't have a lot in common in a lot of ways. However, it was a place for me to put my drums, and I started being able to play them again. I quickly realized that was like not my scene. I hated it. And I was like, I need to not do this, whatever this happened to be. And there was an ad in the local like music rag that just said touring metal drummer needed, must be able to tour. And at that time I was like, I think I was halfway through my sophomore year in college. I didn't know any of these people, but I like cold called it, and I was just like, hey, like, let me try it out. And it was a band called the Mackay that they were all between 4 to 6 years older than me. I might have even been freshman year. I think I was 18. And they really introduced me to like this plethora of music I had never heard. And they just like jumped me in. And then from then on, I was playing above my skill level. Essentially, immersion is what I've always done. And so those guys, like all of a sudden I was playing with essentially touring bands and starting to be international bands at a super young age, faking it till I made it. And I practiced with them, you know, probably a couple times a week for a while. And then once I got a grip of like the style, it was basically like a crusty black metal band. And then we did a lot of like other types of stuff in there. There was like doomy stuff too. But that band, like they mentored me. I owe my entire trajectory to like those guys. It's like Brandon Squires, Ian McCow, Zeke Rogers, Jeff Worrell. Like they were like my weird older brothers that exposed me to so much music. And from there, I got addicted to releasing things on vinyl. And I think that's been always my goal, is to like litter the bargain bins of the world with as many vinyl records as I possibly can. And, you know, it was never about making money. It was very punk rock and like DIY. You know, that was the scene I came up in. But literally by the time I had graduated college, I had done probably like 5 US tours, 3 European tours with multiple bands, and released like, I would bet 6 or 7 vinyl records at that point, if not more. And then that kind of just was it. And I met Dylan Desmond, who's in Bellwitch with me, in that era. Like when I met him, I was, I think, 21, and he was playing in a band called Samothrace that we used to tour with. And so my ties to that specific time are exactly where I am today. It's just we're all old now and I have no hair. So
I'm getting there. Couple of years. I see those hymns ads on Instagram and I'm like starting to save them.
Oh yeah.
So I want to dig a little bit deeper, obviously, because I'm very obsessed with the mechanistic stuff. So like, I'd be super curious to learn what you sounded like when you first joined that trial by fire period. And when you say the other musicians mentored you or schooled you, over what sorts of things? maybe a good way to encapsulate it would be if your older self at the end of that tutelage could have encapsulated a few lessons into a mini course to give your younger self. What do you think were the primary things you picked up?
One of the things that I learned throughout that sort of growth phase, and I would also include me messing around being in like symphonic band, intermediate jazz band, whatever, all the things that I was like essentially faking it through, is that you are what you listen to. And I think that it has to be an authentic expression for anything to be good. I think that anyone who's skilled can fake it.
Shuck and jive.
But it sounds like shit. And it's to me, I think that there has to be this energy. So I think what those guys specifically did for me was they gave me a new palette to immerse into, but then also they gave me the freedom to sort of develop a style without being super heavily genreified, which I think that is something that I still fight against to this day. And I think the internet has made everything worse with that, where people think that everything is supposed to sound a specific way. You hear this riff, this beat goes over it. This is what you do. Like metronomes do that. Drum programming does that. Media programming does that. And I think that those guys gave me a palette. And then for me, it was just playing shows constantly and watching drummers that I connected with their styles. Like I've always been sort of a dictation kind of guy. Like I don't know how to read music of any kind, but I can mimic very quickly. And so I think that I wouldn't change anything different or give any advice. I think that like my advice when kids ask me stuff, and I think I'm actually doing a drum clinic coming up in Vancouver in December. It's basically like follow your own interests and your own sort of heart. And if there's something that catches your attention, lean into that attention. Don't lean into someone telling you how or what you're supposed to do. Because if you don't connect with it authentically, you're going to quit or it's going to suck. And suck is subjective. But, I think that's at least that's where my journey came from. And that's where my style comes from, is like, sure, there's a punk beat somewhere. There's a blast beat somewhere. When it drops, you're supposed to slow down. But if all you do is try to use some sort of rubric to define how that reaction is in your own style, you're going to sound like everybody else. And nobody wants that. And yourself doesn't want that either, So that's my long-winded answer to that question.
I feel like there's an equilibrium with genre conventions where they're kind of a necessary evil. And I would agree that the pendulum is maybe swung too far toward the one-to-one between you hear this type of style, you immediately think this type of beat. But I think there's probably a place for them too. It's one thing I think about is if people are too social media native, if all they're paying attention to is like the social algorithms, then they're maybe going to have too narrow a scope of things they're checking out. And this is true with news as much as it is with drums. We have this illusion that it's volitional. We have this illusion that we're searching for things, but it's not actually. We're just being shown things that the algorithm thinks we might like because of the previous thing we clicked on. And so it's kind of this like Ouroboros spiral to the bottom. But I want to get to one period in your playing that's also interesting to me, which is between your bad experience with lessons and when you first answered that ad to go on tour. How did you sustain the interest? Or was there a waning of interest and then something rekindled it? Were you always kind of playing in the background? Was there any period during those years when you had some inspiration to really go after it? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so my real inspiration I guess, was so I went to two different high schools. Um, because of my bad experience with lessons, it turns out now in my older, more like, I've gone to therapy and things, I realized I was actually just legitimately having trauma reenactment happening when I was in music classes. And I just would act out in music class. I sucked. I almost got expelled from a number of different music classes in my schooling career. But when I was a freshman, and he's actually still one of my best friends, I'm the godfather to his son. I met this guy named Bram Kinchelo, who is he could have been and is probably still one of the best jazz drummers in the country. He's lived a very interesting life. And so he and I met when we were freshmen. I arguably sucked at drums, but he thought I was like funny and cool, and he was like prodigal. He ended up going straight from that high school. We both left the same high school at the same time. He went straight to the Manhattan School of Music, then started playing with like Wynton Marsalis and like Amsterdam, like wild shit. Then he stopped playing music for a while. But anyway, meeting him, he exposed me, it was very, he and I would share music. He exposed me to Mahavishnu Orchestra at a very young age. And then I was like, have you ever heard Mars Volta? Which was something I was into when I was a kid. And he and I had a very similar attitude that was almost like anarchistic when it came to music school and the approach to things. But he was just so good. And I had never seen anyone that good before. And he was my friend. And so like it was almost like competitive would be a complete joke, because it was like it was impossible for me to win, but it was inspirational, and it made me want to get better. And what's really funny is he and I, we're still super close, and I've gone just this crazy weird path. And it's worked out for me, in so many ways. But I think like meeting him, being around him, seeing him play drums was enough of a motivating factor for me to sort of think about fucking around more on the drums, and that's what got me back into it.
Interesting. And what did that fucking around look like? Do you remember? Like, what were some things that he inspired you to do that you went into the shed and experimented with?
Oh, no. I mean, I couldn't even try to do anything he was doing. I guess what I mean was like, it was watching him. Mm-hmm. Then I started playing drums more. And then I was playing with, there was this guy that I had gone to middle school with. He and I had a band in high school. We used to play a lot. I think it was mostly like the trading of music and listening to music together, talking about drums, seeing that drums could take him somewhere. Like I remember when he went to Europe very young, and also went to New York really young for drums. I was like, damn, that's cool. You can like travel for that shit. And then I like quadrupled down on that in my life. But if you're talking, are you talking specifically about like drum styles?
Yes. Because here's my angle. I sort of consider my role translating the etherealness of great drummers down to a little bit of nitty-gritty, but with the huge caveat that it's always going to be not just about what they practiced. So big fair warning to anyone who's listening to this. It's not about exactly what you practice, but I'm still curious.
I guess I was just like sort of traditional, like punk-ish, rock-ish, metal-ish guy. I was like trying to learn songs, so I remember like, me and my buddy, he was a very good guitar player. Like we'd be learning, we would be like, let's see if we could play Dyer's Eve by Metallica, which was like the only song with Slayer double kick. It was just easier than Slayer. So it'd be like, cool, let's try to practice that. Like I remember trying to learn like Pantera songs. I remember when I was in middle school, I thought that NoFX was the fastest band that I'd ever heard. I was like, someday I'll be able to play as fast as NoFX, and it was like a speed race essentially for a long time. But then also, the same token, I was listening to bands like Mars Volta. I was going to a lot of shows. Like Smashing Pumpkins was my favorite band of all time, starting in fourth grade. So like Jimmy Chamberlain was a huge influence for me. And so I think that like I would be trying to see if I could like jack a fill from Jimmy Chamberlain, but like throw it in with, you know, a traditional kind of like straight ahead rock beat. And I think it was really about trying to meld different styles and different influences together. Like if I saw Bram do one crazy triplet fill, you know, I guess that's something I would practice and I use to this day is like anything that's 3/4, 6/8, like I will always opt for the 3/4, no matter what, or I'll throw 3 in there with the 4. So I think as a young kid, I really was like experimenting and struggling around experimenting with time signatures, I guess, but like simply experimenting with tempos is something I've always been really, really intrigued with. Mm. I hate metronomes. I know that people use them and I know why they're valuable. And I understand that it's cool to practice like playing along to something. But that was something I always pushed against at a very young age. I can play with a metronome and record to them. But in my book, it's the human like push-pull that I find really interesting about music. I like to hear it. I like to watch it. So those were all the things I was experimenting with, and I got a lot of pushback with it from different musicians. I would try to practice rudiments, but I don't even know them still. I need a practice pad. I need to do that. But I'm always about playing with people. It's why I'm always in 4 bands.
The metronome thing's interesting too. I literally just made a video about this because I've been turning it off recently. So for about 70 or 80% of my practice time, just because, yeah, I'm experimenting with that. And I feel like there's a point where you've learned time enough and maybe you want to check in with it every once in a while, but where additional perfection is not going to make the music better. Unless there's some super technical prog thing you have to do where, you know, you need to like be super precise at 20 BPM over your comfort level or something like that. But the argument I usually have with other drummers or people in my comments, and I'm curious your opinion about this because I feel like it comes back a lot to personal experience, is people will say like, yeah, metronomes take away your human feel. And my personal experience was my human feel was dog shit. It's like people think like, yeah, if you don't practice with a metronome, you're going to sound like Afro-Cuba de Matanzas or something. You'll have like that perfect gritty, like human, and my human feel was whack. Like it was boring, but then I would rush at weird moments. So I wonder, yeah, whenever I meet someone who's like, I didn't like the metronome, but I could play with it, I'm always like, oh, maybe they just had a better innate sense of time than I did. I'm curious how that lands.
So I think that like the short answer is like, absolutely. Like, I do not have some sort of like amazing time sense. Like I'm no better at time sense than anyone else. But so Bell Witch is the ultimate. People don't believe that Dylan and I are not playing to a metronome. They just don't believe it when we're playing live. People think of my in-ear monitors are a click. But that band is feel. It's feel purely, especially if we're speaking from a drumming perspective. That band could not exist metered. But he and I are extremely intentional about the tempo shifts. That doesn't mean that we're playing the same tempo every night. But it does mean that out of maybe 4 rotations, the third rotation lags extra. And he and I have worked on a very specific lag that we do for years. We call it the Bell Witch lag. And it's like, and it makes it so it's impossible for someone in the audience to actually nod their head to it. And it's a goal. It's supposed to be disassociative. And then the resolve comes when you can actually nod your head to it. It might have taken you 30 minutes to get there though. And I think that like, I love the way that tempo can be manipulated. But that's all subjective. So like I'm not going to say that playing to a click removes the human element, but I will say that it takes a drummer 10 times above my skill level to play to a click and give it human feel. Because I know that there's session drummers out there, and take pop music. Like I like certain pop music, it's all to a click. It's incredible. It's got so much feel sometimes. Mm-hmm. Hip hop, it's all quantized, but then you got there's like that drunk beat that tons of producers use to make it feel like it's lagging despite the fact that it's quantized. So like mm-hmm. everyone knows inherently that there's something irking about the mechanical, click. So I think that, in my life, it's been, yes, I have played to click tracks. I've done records that I have recorded to clicks. Some of the parts that I'm least happy with looking back on are parts that I feel like were either at the wrong tempo because I was playing it to a click, or it limited my own playing. I can hear that I was playing to a click. I don't know if anyone else can, but, so I think in my life, it's led to leaning into the tempo shifts. So rather than so in my death metal band, for example, I'll lean into the tempo shift. If it feels like I'm slowing down a little somewhere, and then speeding up again, it's like, oh, what if that part was just a little slower rather than us trying to keep it the same meter across the board? And it creates this really interesting thing that, again, not every death metal band does. Most of them are to clicks, and it's a way to set one apart. But to some session drummers and to some people that listen to any of these recordings I may be referring to, they might be like, dude, that guy sucks. Like, his tempo sucks. So that's up to the beholder, I think, in some ways. But practicing to a click is extremely valuable, and people should do it because it'll show you where your weaknesses are under the most scrutinizing microscope.
It's interesting. I've kind of struggled to come up with a heuristic for this just because like art's subjective, but we also practice. So it's like, what are we going toward? And like for time as well as for some other things, like the best I can come up with is like, we're practicing so that when we listen back to what we played, it sounds good to us, and it's what we intended to play, and it's not divergent from that in a bad way because of things we couldn't control. And basically, I think it's hard to be too much more objective than that. I don't know. How does that land?
I think that, yeah. So it's like you want to practice to be able to be in control with what one's own output. It doesn't feel out of control or unintended. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. I mean, it's complex, right? It's still like turning around in my own head because for every time I try to pin down a rule, there's like an exception. So it's like, sometimes it should be out of control. Like so some drummers like to go for it and intentionally lose control. And like, that's super cool. So I guess I have the proviso that like, it shouldn't be, you shouldn't dislike it because of something you couldn't control, I suppose, right? Like if you're like, I really went for it, we lost the plot, but it sounds fucking amazing. Like mission accomplished. But if you're like, yeah, this is boring and I just didn't have the facility to produce enough intensity. And like, I don't feel like I was solid enough here. Like, I don't feel like I had the aptitude that I could really lean on this to like fully lean into the musical goal. And when I hear you talk about that, to me, it feels like you have to have some confidence in your timekeeping and your musicality, and through reps and reps and reps of listening to yourself on the playback, to be able to lean into like a tempo change. It's like a trust fall, right? Like you have to be able to go to that zone on the gig.
I completely agree with what you're saying. And I guess the way I would, in my brain, the way it translates is having the tools in one's tool belt to successfully navigate like any given amount of players is how I look at it. You know, like a drummer's, you bring up the trust fall thing. There's something like a little social worky about being a drummer if you're playing in a lot of different bands, because you're not, I talk to Dylan about this all the time and all the people I play with, but there's this weird thing where drummers are at the whim of the riff. Like the drummer's not writing the riff, but the drummer has a lot of control over how that riff sounds and if it's cool or not. And that's where that saying you're only as good as your drummer kind of comes from, which gets thrown around in music land. And so I think that like when it comes down to the tools in the tool belt, you know, for me, it was pure immersion. It's like, you know, with the experience of now, I really don't know how many records I've done, but I believe it's somewhere around 25 or 30, at least, that are on vinyl, between, I don't know, like 8 or 9 bands. That's a lot of recording sessions, and most of them were funded really poorly. Like we had to record really fast, you know, and the drummer's always the first one to have to be done. So like the longer you take, the longer everyone's annoyed with you, you know, and it's really just, there's this high pressure aspect to drumming. And I think that that trust fall element and the confidence element, it's like, you know, as one builds experience, which really the only way I can attribute that would be playing with other musicians and getting their feedback, but specifically playing with musicians you like and you trust and you value their input and their feedback, just like all of life. That's the trust fall. It's like if you can develop that rapport with a specific player where they're willing to like follow you into an experimental category, you then can start to mess around with tempo and you can start to mess around with style. But they have to be willing to trust you to listen to all the ideas first and then start fucking around with all the orchestration things, which is also something that drummers, at least me, I do that all the time. Like I help the players orchestrate constantly. I don't know if all drummers are involved in that element, but with the changing of the dynamics comes orchestration. And I think that that's where I actually really find myself enjoying the creative process at this point, is messing around with the riffs, messing around with the time, messing around with the approach, which the drummer has so much control over. But it has to be with people that are willing to like follow your lead or your ideas, you know?
So this is a perfect segue to the other thing I wanted to ask, because I think in your career, maybe more so even than average, the player you are, the journey you've taken has been shaped by your social connections, which musicians you happened to meet and which musicians you sought out. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit. Like, what are some things that have been helpful for you in terms of navigating the social landscape of music and putting yourself in the right situations to meet the right people?
I'll preface it by the fact that I'm just like an inherently extroverted person, you know, so I that's privileged when it comes to this kind of stuff. But I think no matter what one's personality type is, for me, it's about if you can get the courage to just put yourself out there and put yourself in the position where you're actively trying out with people and you're actively engaging with them. I feel it's the same as like any type of job. You know, if you put yourself out there, even if you're not necessarily a good fit, a recommendation could come in later. And my journey has been completely based on this almost like no shame in my game confidence of just saying, I could do that. And I probably couldn't actually. But if you say, I think I can do that enough, you're going to meet somebody that thinks you can or thinks you might be able to soon, you know? And that's been my experience across the board, while also very clearly developing one's own style, you know? And I think that is the confidence, which comes through practice, and it comes through like embracing the suck is what I always say. You know, it's like when you go show up and you try to play with somebody for the first time, it's going to suck. Never clicks. You could be the best drummer in the world. You know, chances are they're not going to be like, A+, you did such a great job. Like, there's not a single problem with what you just did. You know, it's like, there's going to be something wrong. It's going to take a while to vibe it out. And, but I think as far as like the social element, you know, I feel like playing in a band, getting a job, dating, it's all the same. You know, if you find some people that you can like laugh with, and find some people that you have some common interests with, common musical tastes with, and that you're not inherently intimidated by. Because if there's an intimidation dynamic, or a dynamic where you feel like you're putting the other player on a pedestal, it's almost guaranteed that within the very vulnerable part of the relationship, which is like jamming together and trying to like express oneself, that an unhealthy dynamic could manifest. And that's why bands break up. It's why friendships end through playing music, which everyone has experienced if they play with enough musicians. And so I think that putting oneself out there, but also while advocating for oneself and looking into what, you know, one's own best interests are in that project, you know, it's like, what are you trying to get out of it? You know, and if the expectations are reciprocal, you've got a great relationship, and you might make some good music, you know?
Yeah, I definitely want to dig into the backstory of Bell Witch, but before that, something just occurred to me, which is like, you said you're from Northern California and that you used to skate. And I feel like I have this kind of cultural stereotype of both Northern California and skateboarding, where it is that sort of just like, fuck it, let's try this ethos. And like, hey, this might not go well, but there's this kind of like Northern California stoicism. And I wonder if I'm imagining that, or if that's real.
I think that you're correct. Or at least culturally, people that skateboard are that way. You know, there's like this risk taking, and I am like, you know, for better or worse, have been a risk taker since I, you know, popped out. And again, that is a privilege and a curse, because I've gotten very hurt many times. But but I think that like, you're absolutely correct. But then also that specific culture is kind of where I was at an extremely young age. You know, I was exposed to bands through skate videos. Like hip hop is deep in me and my brother's life. Through there, you know, there was always a cross section between skateboarding, graffiti, and hip hop, and being outside, being with people, whether even if you're smoking and drinking, that's social, and there's that whole like, it's exactly what you said. It's like you're being surrounded by people that are kind of like, fuck it, man, like let's try it, you know, and I do drum that way, and it's unapologetic. I'm like, I don't really care that much when people tell me that it's like, that's not the vibe, or it's like, that's not what it should sound like. Like I'll hear that feedback, and I'll take it, and I'll bring in that feedback and try to alter what my approach is. But there is a point where like, I'll say, I might be the wrong drummer for you. And I've done that a fair amount recently, where it's like, you know what, I think you're looking for somebody else, because you're not going to be able to remove this thing that I do out of it. It's just, that's what I do now, you know? And I think that is something that I would hope every player can get to, where they feel confident enough in their own. It's not even skill level; it's their style, you know. And I think style is infinitely more important than skill forever. And so if people can really lean into their own style and find that and revel in it, you will forever be better than the techiest player out there, I think.
This is all like good reminders for me too. I wish we had another hour, but I want to make sure I ask you about the latest project. So maybe I'm curious both about the genesis of Bellwitch, like how you and Dylan met, and also what makes this latest album special.
Dylan and I met, I think, in 2006 on a tour that old band I was in, the Mackay, was doing. He was in an old band called Samothrace at the time. We used to tour a lot. They lived in Lawrence, Kansas. I lived in Chico, California. And we were just like tour buddies. We partied. We had a good time. We all clicked. His band was incredible. And so basically we played a lot off and on. They all relocated from Lawrence, Kansas to Seattle, I think in 2008, I would bet. I needed to get the hell out of Chico, California, and they all moved out there. It was them and then this other band called Oroku that were from Oklahoma and Lawrence, and which was an old crust band that had a cello. And basically they all moved to Seattle, and I expressed to them that I wanted to get out of Chico, and they were all like, well, yeah, dude, just come to Seattle. Like, and then Oroku was like, dude, you should just be our drummer. And so I moved to Seattle to play drums in Oroku, which had the same guitar player as Samothrace, which was Dylan's band. And we were all homies. It was all the same crew for years at that point. And then, yeah, like Bellwitch started while Samothrace was still a band. Before I was in Bellwitch, you know, there was the original drummer, Adrian, who I was also very close with. And Dylan and I actually ended up living together in 2012, I think it was. And we were just roommates, and things started to not really work out with their old drummer. I was a pretty big advocate for Adrian at that time, because I was like, man, it's a 2-piece band. Like, he's doing vocals. Like, that'll be a crazy shift, you know, like, I don't know, man. But then, you know, he kept asking me if I would try. And I was like, no, man, like, I don't play slow, and I've only done vocals in one band. Like, I don't do vocals. I don't play slow. Like, there's so many drummers out here that we know, you know, in Seattle and Portland. And so anyway, he was talking to other people, and then, you know, finally I kind of caved, and I was like, sure, okay, I'll try it, you know. And I started listening to Four Phantoms, which wasn't out yet, I don't think, or had just come out. But basically I listened to it, got together, we practiced in our basement, because 2 of my bands practiced in our basement at that time, and we had all the gear. And then after the first practice, you know, we made it through, I think it's the first song on Four Phantoms, which is probably like 25 minutes long. We made it through the whole take. I had just memorized it. The tempos were like meh, but and then from then on we just did it. And it's been a really cool, just like the way that the band has, the trajectory of that band, and the way that he and I have almost like sidestepped and then continued without changing the history, and like making sure that it came together as like a story, has been really interesting, you know. So like I basically did almost all the touring in support of Four Phantoms. I did not play drums on the record. That's where I learned how to do vocals and drum. My second show with Bellwitch was the beginning of a 4-week European tour. It was pretty nerve-wracking. And then it started the long journey of me adding a billion instruments to it. It started with me wanting to add organ. I was playing slow. I got the vocals. I was like, I think I could do more. What should we add? And you were like, it's a funeral doom band. Organ. We added organ on Mirror Reaper. You know, and what's crazy is Mirror Reaper was the first record, first anything that Dylan and I wrote together. That shot the band off. No one was expecting that. And, you know, Adrian died during the recording of that, or not recording, but during the writing of that album. There was talk of the band even stopping. It was a really heavy situation. But we continued on, and then it's basically been this very slow, in some ways, but very fast, in other ways, evolution of adding to our sound. You know, I started doing harmonies with him vocally also, which was new. Once I got a hang of the single organ foot pedal, I was like, I think I have thought about a way to do the double side. So I could do lead and rhythm at the same time, like multi-chords, just like a piano. Every electronic person I've ever talked to told me it was impossible the way I wanted to do it. Every person. And arguably no one has done exactly the way that I have this set up, because it's a little bit insane. But it comes from our tempos being so loose and so free-flowing. And so basically, now over the last 5 years or so, it's gone from, you know, a piano module and an organ module to a Minotaur, a Mellotron module, a 3 oscillator synthesizer, the piano module, both organ sides. It's all live, not a computer used, no triggers ever. It's become this really involved thing, and I'm super proud of it. And it's really cool how Dylan's playing has evolved as well. And so amidst all of that, Eric Mogridge had been on every single Bellwitch record starting from the beginning, doing guest vocals. We did the last recording that Eric was on with Bellwitch proper was Mirror Reaper. He did a very substantial part of the vocals on that. And there was talk after that between Dylan and I and Eric, obviously, but we were like, hey, like, we should continue like exploring this collaboration essentially deeper. Like, what would it be like if we kind of started something separate so we could do a little bit different and a little bit more than Bellwitch? Because Bellwitch has some pretty harsh stipulations involved with what we're doing and the approach and what it's supposed to be at this point. And so enter Stygian Bow. You know, the first volume of that was essentially like creating a branch in a tree where we were giving Eric way more free reign on vocals, and then also like, let's have you be the guitar player. Let's be a power trio, you know? And so the first album was me experimenting heavily with building out my setup with electronics. There's organ, there's piano, there's synths all over that record, in a way that there wasn't on Mirror Reaper. And then we treated that one as a truly collaborative record where there was a very strict like Bellwitch part. There were Bellwitch parts. There were parts where I was screaming, and then there were parts where Eric was the main vocalist. And after that recording was complete, we had a precedent set on what we wanted to continue to do, which is now where we're at with the new Stygian Bow record. And I think that this one is a much more intentional, much more formulated expression of the three of us playing together rather than two individual entities collaborating. And so this record was really challenging in its own right because we had to figure out how to really meld the three personalities together, and figure out exactly what this record was going to sound like, and actually let go of a lot of rules and boundaries that had been put up from the previous one. So I think it's a really awesome version of that. You know, it's exactly what it is. the writing process was sort of long and involved. And then we really just sort of tried to strip it down to its most basic form in a lot of ways. The songs for us are short, they're between 10 and 20 minutes long. They could have been way longer. So it's like, it was a cool thing. We experimented with, I guess maybe a little bit more of a traditional songwriting approach. There's some verses and there's some choruses and there's some bridges. You can nod your head to this. There's rockers, and it's really cool. And I think Eric knocked it out of the park with his vocals. The guitar playing's awesome, and I think Dylan and I found a really cool way to immerse into three-piecedom, and I'm really happy with how it came out.
Are you guys planning to tour as that three-piece unit?
Yeah, we've got a little West Coast tour coming up in December. We're doing a 3-week European tour, late January, early February, with 40 Watt Sun, around this pretty cool experimental music festival in Berlin called CTM. And then, yeah, we'll be touring a bunch. We've got another couple festivals lined up that'll be announced in a bit. And yeah, we'll be playing. We tour hard. Always, we're notorious for that.
Good. Well, I think that's a perfect segue to ask, where would you tell people to go to look up what you've got going on, whether it's you personally or the band? Like, I know the band, Bellwitch, has an Instagram, but yeah, where would you send somebody to figure out, like, if you're coming to their town, or where to pick up the music or anything else?
For Bellwitch, we're kind of all over all the things. You can check out the Instagram page. We're on all the streaming platforms. I guess these days, probably the way the internet is, Instagram's a good spot for that, but that just shows how old we are. But yeah, that's Bellwitch Doom. Corpus Awful, which is spelled OFFAL, is like my newest death metal project. It's on 20 Buck Spin. You can find us on Instagram on all the streaming platforms. That's the most extreme drumming I've done in a long time. Also, yeah, so Bellwitch is Profound Lore. Autophagy is the other death metal band I'm in that's out of Portland. Same thing, Instagram. That label's Pulverize Records. I'm always kind of cruising around. And yeah, YouTube, fuck Spotify. We're still on it, but find it anywhere else.
Well, amazing. I think that's a great note to end on. It felt like we could have gone for another hour. There are a bunch of other things I wanted to unpack, but yeah, super cool getting to meet you, picking your brain, hearing your thoughts about stuff.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Nate. Thanks so much, man. I appreciate it.
Likewise. Take care. Have a good one.
Yeah.